Hello and welcome to the Chapter 10 Hazardous Materials of the 8th edition of the ISTA Code Enforcement Manual. Uh, we are going to be discussing uh, uh, in this module about learning objective number 1, which is explaining the application of hazardous material regulations. Hazardous materials present a challenging problem for fire inspectors because they commonly have multiple hazards present uh, in the form or the process of which they're being used in. Physical hazards where materials burn or accelerate burning and either detonate or deflagrate, or there's the release of health hazard material can either injure or incapacitate the public or emergency responders. An inspector examining the scope and purpose of the IFC or the NFPA 1 will find that over half of the codes are focused on hazardous material or processes that use these materials. So the IFC, the International Fire Code, or the NFPA 1, which is the Fire Prevention Code. Uh, Some of the examples of chapters that deal with hazardous material are with flammable finishes, fumigation, dispensing for motor vehicle fuel. Uh, when you look at the International Fire Code, we are looking at chapters 50 through 67 and NFPA 400, which focus on preventing and minimizing incidents involving the storage, use, and handling and dispensing of hazardous materials. When we're talking about hazardous materials, it is safe to say that in all of our jurisdictions, there is some level of, of exposure as far as hazardous materials go. So if it's material or processes, uh, a an incident can go from an ordinary fire to where it can involve, or the result of a fire can be uh, can turn into hazardous at any given time. The slide here was a fire in a manufacturing plant up in Rockton, Illinois in 2021, a very large plant industrial wise that from what I was told, there was some maintenance being done that somehow an ignition source involving some of the materials that were on hand and eventually involving a large portion of the facility. Regulations and model fire codes emphasize reporting the storage and use of hazardous materials above certain quantities. Model codes mandate the permit application to submit a properly prepared hazardous material management plan or hazardous material inventory statement to the fire code official under their authority to issue either a construction or an operational type permit. Businesses that fail to report the storage of hazardous materials are violating this jurisdiction's fire code. The burden of reporting rests with the business because they are bringing this unique hazard to the jurisdiction. Hazardous waste materials can be chemical compounds that are mixtures of used industrial products. Changing chemicals from their useful function to a waste can complicate their classification, whether it's in the International Fire Code or NFPA 400, which is their hazardous material code. Hazardous materials responses generally require that responding personnel be specially trained and equipped to manage a chemical release. Such incidents may also require additional time to mitigate, just like that incident in Rockton. The IFC and NFP 400 both require, as a condition of an operating permit, that a business designate a fire department liaison or emergency response coordinator. They're going to be responsible for understanding the hazards of storing, using, and handling materials, responsible for explaining the site's emergency response procedures and access to the facility's safety data sheets. They may also be ready to assist the fire department in planning that emergency response, their tactic and strategy. Confining a hazardous material in its container, tank, or vessel is is of paramount importance. One of the bigger problems inspectors will find concerns the design and construction of storage tanks. There are numerous incidents that have occurred where the wrong construction materials or wrong tank assembly methods have resulted in a hazardous material release. In addition, business may try to reuse abandoned tanks to store hazardous material. Uh, so once a design professional has evaluated used equipment, it can be used again safely. So is there a possibility that a vessel can have multiple uses? Yes. Um, as much as, and it's also a possibility that it has a singular use, and that's where you need to bring in the manufacturer or that subject matter expert to help you out. However, when the construction materials have not been compared to the hazard and the chemistry of the stored materials, the results can include rapid and catastrophic container or tank failure. This concern extends to the piping systems as well, and whatever method you would take for the product in the tank to move to other areas, processes, etc. So as inspectors, you have to be vigilant about small changes to the plant, the building, and the process, and how that might have been impacted or evaluated. So we're looking at tanks, containers, and the piping system. As inspectors, you need to ask how the stored material will affect these tanks, the piping, and any valves that come in contact, depending on the state of which the material is in, and how hazardous it can be, or how hazardous can it turn into. So, a lot of things to consider. Pressure relief mechanisms or the mechanics uh, is critical for uh, most processes or all processes, especially when we're thinking in terms of hazardous material. So regardless of the method, pressure relief is that important element that the fire inspector needs to one, identify and be able to evaluate. Uh, Hazardous materials stored in containers, cylinders, tanks, or pressure vessels are always assumed to be capable of being exposed to fire, and an unwanted fire can pressurize that container or a container. Uh, it might create enough pressure to where the container might catastrophically fail, might explode if it doesn't have the proper means or the adequate means to vent itself via pressure relief. So a pressure relief mechanism device can be heat activated or one that responds to an increase in pressure. It all can be used to be a design where the container safely vents under controlled fire exposure. All right, let's talk a little bit about hazardous materials and the reactivity and flammability and how we protect it. Um, so many hazardous material do have qualities to where they are flammable or can react violently or are, as I say, were somewhat volatile. So NFPA 400 and the IFC, the International Fire Code, require certain levels of fire protection for many different types of classes of hazardous materials. So this protection can include locating the materials in fire-resistant enclosures like cabinets or enclosures that have some type of fire-resistant uh, ratings, or hazardous material storage cabinets. So based on the hazards of the stored material, fire-resistant construction may be required to separate out the rooms or areas where hazardous materials are stored or used from other areas of a building. In other cases, both model codes require that an automatic sprinkler system protect that that area of the building or a section of the structure. The goal of the codes is to protect the stored material from fire and to limit the risk of its involvement. As an inspector, you'll need to rely on particular NFPA standards for a given class of hazardous material to determine if the sprinkler discharge density and the design area are correct for the stored materials. All right, let's talk about some exemptions. The hazardous materials provision in the International Fire Code and NFPA 400 cover a variety of processes and uses. However, these codes do not cover all situations where hazardous materials are stored, used, or handled. In some cases, federal or provincial laws preempt their storage or use. In other cases, specific requirements in the model codes take precedent over the hazardous material requirements. It's important for inspectors to understand that certain activities or processes that involve hazardous materials may be exempt from regulation, including the transportation of hazardous materials, pesticides, fungicides, and rodenticides, and then certain building systems. Hazardous materials transportation is outside the scope of the International Fire Code and NFPA 400. The Department of Transportation and its Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, PIMSA, regulate hazardous materials transportation and its pipelines in the United States. The IFC and NFPA 400 regulate facilities that store, package, or use hazardous materials. Another exemption is the application of pesticides, fungicides, and rodenticides. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, approves the use of these types of materials in the United States. The exemption does not limit the inspector's authority to apply the fire code to the storage or manufacturing of these materials. Certain building systems that store or use hazardous materials can be exempt from hazardous material regulations. In the IFC, mechanical refrigeration, fuel oil storage, and stationary storage battery systems are generally exempt from the hazardous materials provision. To accomplish the code's intent, fire inspectors must become familiar with your adopted codes in your jurisdictions and the standards applicable to hazardous materials storage, use, and handling. The IFC and NFPA 400 adopt a number of standards by reference. These standards reflect the minimum requirements for the design and construction of containers, cylinders, tanks, and piping systems. They also address proper marking and identification of cylinders and hazardous materials piping. There are other standards that provide guidance to the fire inspector in ensuring that the proper classification of gases and other materials. So that concludes objective number 1, and look forward to speaking with you in objective 2.